ash drifts like black snow through a winter that has no mercy. Somewhere in the pine dark, men scream, and the sound cuts off as if a blade has passed through it. A great body moves between burning trunks, chains dragging, iron ringing faintly under the roar of distant fires. Eyes open in the smoke, not yellow, not animal, but like coals blown to life. On the ground, paw prints fill with blood and do not cool. If this tale pulls you in, give it a like and subscribe for more Middle-earth what-ifs told as living history. Share where you are listening from and what moment you think would break the world the fastest. The comments become the campfire for these timelines. In the elder days, before the names of Gondor and Rohan were spoken by any tongue, there was a hound that did not belong to the wild. Huan had come out of the west with the Noldor, a creature of the Valar's grace, great as a small horse, swift as hunger, and gentle in the hands of those he trusted. He followed Celegorm once, and for a time the long hunt pleased him. The cold air of Beleriand, the clean scent of deer and boar, the bright snap of hooves over frost. Yet the world had a deeper stink beneath the green things, a rot that rose from the north and made even brave hearts swallow hard. There was a limit laid on Huan, near doom spoken long before any of the elves who then walked in Middle-earth could remember. He would not speak with words until his final hour, and he could not be slain save by the greatest wolf that ever lived. Many heard that and took comfort, for they thought it meant invincibility. Few considered what else it meant. If such a creature could only be brought down by a wolf beyond all wolves, what power might desire to shape that wolf, or to become it? The first crack in the tale opened not in Angband, but on an isle of stone. Tolan Gauhoth had once been fair, and then it had become a place where even birds forgot how to sing. Sauron held it then, a lieutenant clothed in shadow and sorcery, and his werewolves patrolled the slopes like living malice. When Beren came there in desperate haste and Lúthien followed after, the air itself seemed to tighten around their throats. The gates were not merely doors, but wounds in the world, and the smell that poured from them was wet fur, old blood, and something like extinguished candles. Huan went with Lúthien because love had already pulled him away from Celegorm's leash. He padded beside her as if the ground belonged to him, but his ears were pinned against sounds that no one else could hear. Lúthien cloak moved like twilight, her hair like spilled night. She did not look back often, but when she did, her gaze rested on Huan as on a friend she could not speak to in full. Sauron came out to meet them as a darkness that decided to take shape. His voice was smooth, not loud, but it reached into the mind the way a cold hand reaches under a blanket. "Turn back," he said, and he smiled as if he pitied them. "The hound is mighty, but I have broken mightier things than flesh." Then he shifted, and the change was like watching smoke learn bone. A great wolf stood where the sorcerer had been, and its eyes were pits in which starlight died. Huan answered with a growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. He sprang, and his weight struck like a battering ram. The wolves of Sauron rushed in, but they broke against Huan as waves break on a cliff. The fight was brutal and swift, fangs snapping, claws raking stone. Beren watched through bars with blood on his lips and wondered in a sudden flicker of hope, if doom could be wrestled down by brute courage. Sauron fought with more than teeth. He fought with will. A shadow coiled around Huan's limbs, seeking to bind, to numb, to command. Huan snarled and tore at it, and when his jaws closed on Sauron's throat, the island itself seemed to shudder. Sauron yielded, and in that yielding he did something small and terrible. He pressed his muzzle close to Huan's ear as if to whisper, and though no one heard words, Lúthien saw Huan flinch. She saw too, a thin line of dark fire run along Huan's neck under the fur, as if an invisible collar had tightened. Sauron's voice returned, not to the air, but to the marrow. "You are not of this land," he breathed, and the sound carried the taste of iron. "Even the west can be leashed." The werewolves fled. The tower fell into silence, broken only by the panting of the hound and the soft, shaken inhale of Lúthien as she hurried to Beren. In that moment, it felt like an ending. Sauron defeated, captives freed, the path to Angband open. But Huan stood apart, head lowered. He shook once, as if water clung to him, and the movement sent a few black droplets onto the stone. They hissed where they landed. Lúthien approached and laid her hand on his brow. Huan did not pull away, yet his skin twitched beneath her touch, and for a heartbeat, his eyes reflected not her face, but a distant furnace. In the days that followed, as they fled the isle and hid in thickets where the wind smelled of resin and fear, Lúthien began to notice little things. Huan no longer slept as deeply. When the night grew cold, he sometimes pressed his flank against a tree and shivered as if fevered. Once, when Beren tried to bind a wound on Huan's shoulder, Huan snapped at the cloth with sudden anger, then immediately lowered his head as if ashamed. Beren spoke softly to Lúthien as they crouched under a ledge while rain drummed on stone. "He is wounded in spirit," Beren said. "Can such a creature be harmed that way?" Lúthien listened to Huan's breathing in the dark. "Everything that lives can be harmed," she answered. "The question is whether harm becomes a doorway." Far to the north, in Angband's deep halls, Morgoth heard the report of Sauron's defeat. The Dark Lord did not rage as lesser tyrants raged. He sat upon his black throne, and the iron crown above his brow caught the firelight like a trap catches sun. "He bit the hound," Morgoth said, and his voice was almost curious. "Did he leave his mark?" Sauron knelt below, his shadow long on the stones. "A seed," he said, "a word without sound. It will grow in the right soil." Morgoth's mouth curved in a smile that did not soften his face. "Then let it grow in my garden." That was the second turning of the knife, though no one in the woods knew it yet. The quest that followed became legend even in the true history. A mortal man and an immortal maiden daring the gates of hell for a jewel of unsullied light. In this altered thread, the path looked the same at first. The same black peaks cut the sky. The same ash fell like dirty snow. The same fear pressed on lungs until breaths came shallow. Yet the air around Huan grew heavier with each step toward Thangorodrim, as if an unseen chain dragged behind him, snagging on stones. When they came at last to the outer doors of Angband, it was Huan who bore them in disguise, as in the songs. Lúthien wove her enchantments, and Beren clung to her as a drowning man clings to driftwood. Orcs shrank back. The wolves of the gate sniffed and whined, uncertain. But one wolf, older and scarred, drew close to Huan. Its nose hovered near Huan's neck. A low whimper rose from it, and its eyes went wide, as if it smelled something it had never expected to smell on a creature like this. It backed away, tail between its legs. Huan's ears flattened, his lips pulled back from his teeth. For a second, he looked less like a loyal hound and more like a beast straining against a muzzle. Within, the halls of Angband were vast and oppressive, carved from rock like the insides of a mountain's hatred. Torches burned with a sickly light, and the smoke stung eyes and tasted of pitch. The clang of hammers echoed from far chambers, where slaves worked until they fell and were dragged aside like broken tools. Among those slaves was a man from the house of Hador, captured in a skirmish on the plain. His name had once mattered to someone. Here it was reduced to a number shouted by an orc overseer. He lifted molten metal with tongs until his arms trembled. When he stumbled, the lash came down, and the smell of burnt skin rose sharper than the smoke. He heard a different sound then, faint but unmistakable. The soft pad of paws, the clink of something metallic, like a chain brushing stone. He looked up, eyes watering, and glimpsed a great hound passing between pillars. For an instant, hope flared so hot it hurt. Then the hound's eyes turned slightly toward him, and the man's hope curdled. There was knowledge in that gaze, and hunger. The man lowered his eyes fast, as if that could hide his soul. Lúthien and Beren came before Morgoth's throne. The Dark Lord watched them the way a smith watches impurities rise in a crucible. When Lúthien began to sing, her voice filled the hall like clear water poured into a poisoned cup. Orcs swayed. Balrogs leaned on their whips as if suddenly weary. Even Morgoth's eyelids grew heavy under the weight of beauty he could not create. The moment held. The world teetered. It could have ended there, in triumph, in escape, in the Silmarils stolen from the Iron Crown and carried back into night. Then Morgoth did what only one who had existed before the world could do. He slept, yes, but his malice did not. In the deep of his slumber, something in him remained awake, like an ember in ash. As Beren reached up to cut the Silmaril free, Morgoth's hand shifted, slow and subtle. Fingers heavy as pillars brushed against Huan's neck as the hound stood guard, poised and silent. Where Morgoth touched, the invisible collar Sauron had planted flared into being. Not seen by elf or man, it was seen by the hound's flesh. Huan's body tensed. A suppressed sound trembled in his throat, not a growl, not a whine, something like pain swallowed. Morgoth's sleeping voice slid into the hound's bones. Serve. Huan did not move. He did not leap upon Beren. He did not snap at Lúthien. He simply stood, rigid as carved stone, while the command sank deeper than any bite. Beren cut the jewel free. The Silmaril blazed in his hand, and the light was so pure it seemed to accuse the darkness around it. For an instant, Morgoth's face, even in sleep, looked almost like a wounded thing. Then the knife slipped. Blood fell. Morgoth stirred. The great hall filled with sudden, catastrophic awakening. Lúthien's song turned sharp, urgent, a net thrown over rising wrath. She cast her cloak upon Morgoth's eyes, and sleep crashed back down like a wave. They fled. They ran through corridors that suddenly seemed to bend and shift, as if the fortress itself tried to mislead them. Wolves howled behind, and the sound bounced off stone until it became impossible to tell how many were coming. At the gates, Carcharoth waited. He he was the greatest wolf that ever lived, swollen with sorcery and hunger, bred by Morgoth as an answer to prophecy, a living contradiction to hope. His jaws dripped, and the drool smoked where it touched the ground. His eyes fixed on the Silmaril like a starving man's eyes fix on bread. Huan launched himself without hesitation. The two beasts met with a crash that shook dust from the archways. Teeth found flesh. Claws tore. The night rang with snarls. Lúthien and Beren ran. Beren's hand clenched the Silmaril, and its light flashed between his fingers with each stride. Behind them, Huan and Carcharoth rolled in the ash, and a storm of fur and blood. Then Huan froze. The collar, unseen, tightened like a noose. Morgoth's command did not order him to betray, not in any obvious way. It ordered him to choose. In the split second where Huan's jaws were locked on Carcharoth's throat, Huan's head turned slightly toward Beren's retreating back. The Silmaril's light painted the air, and the hound's eyes for that heartbeat. I reflected it not as warmth, but as something to be extinguished. Would the hound of Valinor obey the darkness that had touched him? Could a creature made for loyalty be used like a knife in another hand? Huan's muscles trembled. His teeth clenched harder on Carcharoth, and the great wolf shrieked in pain. The collar burned. A sound broke from Huan's throat. Not words, but a raw, a strangled cry that made even the wolves falter. He chose Lúthien. Huan wrenched Carcharoth's head aside and threw his full weight into the fight, driving the wolf backward long enough for Beren and Lúthien to vanish into the waste. Carcharoth tore free at last, blood streaming, and bolted after them, maddened not only by hunger, but by humiliation. Huan staggered, sides heaving. He stood alone before Angban's gate, ash settling on his fur like grey frost. The collar's heat sank inward and did not fade. In Doriath, the forest of Thingol, spring did not arrive cleanly that year. The leaves opened, but their green looked thin, as if the light had less strength. Melian, Maya, and Queen stood under the branches and listened to the rustle of her girdle, the enchantment that guarded the realm. It whispered like a wall of reeds in wind. She felt a pressure against it, not an army, not a spell cast from outside, but something like a thread of doom drawn taut and plucked. "What is it?" Thingol asked, and though he stood tall, there was unease in the set of his shoulders. Melian's eyes were distant. "A door has been touched," she said. "Not opened. Not yet." Far away, in Nargothrond, Orodreth received rumors like cold water poured down the spine. Beren and Lúthien had gone to Angband. Some laughed at the madness. Some wept at the courage. Some, in the quiet of their chambers, wondered if such defiance would draw the eye northward again. In the forests nearer the lands that would one day be Rohan, a small band of men hunted deer in heavy mist. They did not know the names of Silmarils. They did not care about the quarrels of elves. They cared about meat, shelter, and the cries they heard at night when wolves gathered. That night, the mist thickened until it seemed to press into their mouths. Their fire burned low. One of them, a boy barely grown, they heard a chain drag across stones somewhere beyond the ring of light. He whispered, "There is something there." An older hunter spat into the dirt. "It is only wolves." The boy listened harder. The chain sound came again, closer. Wolves did not wear chains. He did not sleep. The hunt of Carcharoth tore through the land like a wildfire. The great wolf, with the Silmaril burning in his belly, raged and howled, and where he passed, grass withered. Animals fled. Even the trees seemed to lean away. Beren and Lúthien reached Doriath at last, battered and bleeding, and the forest received them with the scent of wet earth and crushed leaves. But behind them came the wolf like a living calamity. Thingol gathered hunters. Mablung and Beleg took up spear and bow. Huan arrived too, limping, blood crusted in his fur, and his eyes held a strange brightness, even in daylight, as if embers had lodged behind them. Lúthien ran to him. She pressed her face into his neck and breathed in the familiar warmth. Under the fur, she felt a faint vibration, like metal under skin. Her breath caught. She drew back and looked into his eyes. For an instant, she saw two reflections, herself and a crown of iron. She did not speak of it, not then. The wolf was coming. Carcharoth burst into the forest with a crash, snapping saplings like twigs. Hunters scattered. Arrows struck and burned away in the heat that radiated from his body. The air smelled of scorched hair and sap. His jaws gaped, and in their depths, the Silmarils' light flashed like a star trapped in a throat. Huan leaped to meet him as prophecy demanded. The two collided and the ground shook. Beleg's arrows flew, Mablung's spear struck. Men shouted, elves cried warnings. In the chaos, ordinary voices rose too. A Sindarin hunter gasping as he slipped in mud, a young guard shouting for his brother, a woman in the trees clutching a child and whispering, "Do not look." Huan and Carcharoth grappled. Teeth sank into shoulders. Blood sprayed, hot and dark. Carcharoth's belly glowed from within, and the glow pulsed as if the jewel itself fought to escape the flesh that imprisoned it. Then, at the edge of the fight, Thingol stepped forward, spear raised, eyes hard as carved stone. He moved like a king who believed the world would obey him because it always had, and Huan's collar flared. The command did not say, "Kill the king." It said only, "Break the circle." Huan's head snapped toward Thingol. His lips peeled back. For a fraction of a second, every hunter saw it. Not confusion, not madness, but intent. Lúthien screamed, a sound that cut through every other sound like a blade of glass. Huan. The hound hesitated. In that hesitation, Carcharoth tore free and lunged at Thingol. Huan moved at last, too late to stop the first impact. Carcharoth's jaws closed on Thingol's arm. Bone cracked. The king fell, blood spraying onto leaves. Mablung drove his spear into the wolf's flank, and Beleg's arrow struck the wolf's eye. Huan, with a roar that shook the branches, threw himself between wolf and king, taking the next bite meant for Thingol's throat. Carcharoth's teeth sank into Huan's neck where the collar burned. The Silmarils' light flared. Huan's body convulsed. In that convulsion, the collar's iron seemed to become real. Those closest saw something impossible. Faint lines like black metal shimmering under fur, as if a chain had been welded into the hound's flesh. Huan clamped his jaws on Carcharoth's throat and held. The wolf thrashed, and the Silmarils' fire seared through flesh. Hunters stabbed. The forest rang with shouting, until at last Carcharoth went still. Silence fell in pieces, broken by sobs and the wet sound of blood dripping from leaves. Thingol lay on the ground, pale, his breath shallow. Melian knelt beside him, her hands glowing faintly as she tried to draw life back into torn flesh. She could heal much, but death is not only a wound, it is a door that opens inward. Thingol's eyes found Lúthien's. "Daughter," he whispered, and his voice was thin as smoke. "Your doom has come home." Lúthien's face was streaked with ash and tears. "Do not speak," she begged. Thingol's gaze shifted to Huan, who lay trembling, blood bubbling at his throat where Carcharoth had bitten. The great hound's eyes were wide, and for the first time, the words pressed against the doom that had held his tongue. Thingol tried to lift his hand, but it fell back. His last breath left him on a sigh that smelled of crushed leaves. Melian bowed her head, and in that moment the girdle around Doriath shivered. The enchantment was tied not only to her power, but to the marriage that anchored her to this realm. With Thingol's death, something loosened. A wall did not fall at once, but cracks spread through it like frost in stone. Huan's chest heaved. His mouth opened, and at last he spoke, as prophecy allowed, but the voice that emerged was not purely his. "Lady," he said, and the sound was deep, edged with strain. "There is iron in me." Lúthien knelt beside him, hands trembling as she pressed them to his neck. "No," she whispered. "No chain can hold you." Huan's eyes fixed on hers with desperate clarity. "It was planted on the isle," he rasped. "It was awakened under the throne. It burns when the north calls. Do not trust my teeth when the world goes red." Then his gaze slid toward the dead wolf, and beyond it, as if he saw the gates of Angband even through the trees. His lips pulled back again, not at Lúthien, but at the air, at the invisible presence that tugged at him. "What did Morgoth promise you?" Lúthien asked, and the question was not accusation, but fear. Huan's voice dropped. "He promised nothing," he said. "He commanded." Huan shuddered. Blood filled his mouth. He forced the next words out as if they were stones. "When I die, do not follow me." His body went still. The hound that had never fled, that had carried hope on 4 paws through darkness, lay dead on the blood-wet leaves of Doriath. For a heartbeat, it felt like the end of the tale. Carcharoth slain. The Silmaril recovered from the wolf's corpse, blazing clean in Melian's hands. Morgoth's great beast defeated, the price paid in blood and grief. Relief moved through the hunters like a weak dawn. Some laughed shakily. Some sat down hard and stared at their hands as if they could not believe they were still attached. A young guard, barely older than the boy in the mist, touched Huan's fur with 2 fingers and whispered, "Thank you," though he did not know if beasts heard thanks. Then Melian looked up, and her face had the stillness of deep water. "The girdle is wounded," she said quietly. In the days that followed, the world did not pause to mourn. In Menegroth, the 1,000 caves, as grief echoed in corridors of stone, Lúthien sat beside her mother, silent. Beren stood at the edge of the hall like a man who had already died once and did not wish to die again. The Silmarils' light made the jewels of Doriath seem dim. Celegorm and Curufin heard of Thingol's death and the Silmarils' presence like sharks scenting blood. Dwarves heard too, and their hearts hardened with a familiar hunger. Word travelled outward, and with each telling it, became less truth and more spark thrown into dry grass. Yet the strangest news travelled in whispers among those who could feel the unseen. Hunters spoke of hearing a chain sound at night near Huan's burial mound. Dogs in the woods began to whine and refused to go near that place. Once, a child of the Sindar woke screaming, swearing that a great hound had stood in her doorway with eyes like fire, and that its mouth had opened to speak, but only ash had fallen out. Melian knew then what Morgoth had done. Amaya's thought can be sharp as lightning. She saw it with sudden clarity. Morgoth could not touch the Silmaril without pain, could not corrupt its light, but he could corrupt those who loved that light. He could take what guarded hope and turn it into a hunter. She said it aloud to no one at first. How could she? To name it was to make it real in the ears of those already drowning in loss. Lúthien rose one night and walked alone through Morgoth. The caves smelled of damp stone and fading flowers. The air tasted of metal from forged weapons stacked in fear. She went to the place where Huan had been laid, his body wrapped and honored. She knelt and pressed her forehead to the cold earth. "If you hear me," she whispered into the dark, "fight him. Fight even in death." Something moved beneath the soil, and not a body, but a presence. The air chilled. Lúthien felt the hair on her arms lift. In her mind, an image flashed. A black chain, glowing at the links, pulled taut across a wasteland. Then the sensation passed, leaving only the smell of earth and the distant drip of water. Melian watched from afar, unseen, and her heart tightened. She had lived long enough to know that some battles are decided not by strength, but by what is done with the dead. The fall of Doriath came sooner in this thread, not because armies were stronger, but because protection was thinner and trust was brittle. Thingol's death left a hollow that echoed through decisions. Dwarves came with honeyed words and sharp eyes, offering craft for the Silmarils setting. The light drew them like moths. When violence erupted, it erupted fast. In the deep halls, the first scream sounded like any scream, sudden, human, terrifying. Then came the ring of steel, the crash of bodies against stone, and the smell of blood thickening the air. A Sindarin woman fled with her hands slick, carrying a bundle of cloth that contained nothing precious to history, only bread and a child's wooden toy. She ran through corridors lit by torches that spat and smoked, and she heard behind her a sound that did not belong among boots and blades. A chain dragged. She turned her head just enough to see a shadow moving against the torchlight, low and swift. For an instant, she thought it was a wolf that had slipped in with the chaos. Then she saw the size of it and the way the torchlight did not reflect in its eyes but seemed to feed them. She did not stop running. In the melee, Dior, Thingol's heir through Lúthien, fought like a young stag cornered by hounds. He was brave, and bravery is sometimes only the ability to keep moving while the world collapses. He did not see the shadow hound until it was upon him. Its jaws closed on his arm, and the pain was cold, not hot. He felt strength drain from him, as if his blood had turned to water. He struck at it, and his blade passed through something that was not entirely flesh. The shadow hound released him and vanished into smoke and darkness, leaving behind only the faint clink of chain links striking stone. Dior survived that bite. He lived long enough to see Morgoth's treasures scattered and its halls stained. He lived long enough to send Elwing away with the Silmaril, pressing the jewel into her hands with fingers that shook. "Run," he told her, and his voice was hoarse with grief and urgency. "Do not look back." Elwing fled through the forest with the Silmaril wrapped tight, its light muted beneath cloth. The trees seemed to bend around her as if to hide her. Yet at times, she heard something following at a distance, not footsteps, but that faint metallic whisper. She reached the havens at last, and the sea air hit her like a slap, sharp and clean. Sailors gathered around her, faces pale as they saw the jewels glow. Arundel, still young then, saw it too, and in his eyes the light sparked into purpose. But even as hope gathered at the shore like a wind filling sails, a shadow watched from the tree line. It did not step into the open. It did not need to. It was learning. It was patient. Morgoth's war ground on. Gondolin fell as it always did, though in this thread the whispers of a black hound reached its streets before the flames did. Tuor heard those whispers and held Idril tighter. He did not know why his dreams were full of paws padding on stone. At last, the plea went west. Arundel sailed, bearing the Silmaril, and the Valar's wrath came like a storm that breaks a continent. The War of Wrath shattered mountains, drained seas, and rewrote coastlines. Those who lived through it spoke of thunder that sounded like the world splitting. An ordinary sailor from the coasts that would one day be Gondor clung to a mast as the sea boiled around him. Salt burned his eyes. Wind tore at his clothes. He prayed not for victory, but for his bones to remain together long enough to reach land again. He saw shapes in the storm, great eagles, dragons falling like ruined towers, and once, on a ridge of broken rock, a black hound standing perfectly still, as if watching the gods fight. When Morgoth was taken at last, chained and bound, and his iron crown hammered into a collar of humiliation, many wept with relief. The sky seemed bluer. The air tasted less of ash. People dared to imagine that evil could be locked away like a beast in a cage. Morgoth did not struggle much as he was dragged to the door of night. He turned his head once, slowly, as if listening. In the ruin of a battlefield, where broken spears stuck up like dead reeds, and the shadow hound lifted its head. Its eyes glowed faintly, and for the first time since Huan's death, something like recognition flickered through its form. Morgoth's voice, low and satisfied, carried across distance, not in sound, but in intention. "Go," he sent, like a command thrown as a spear. "When they forget me, remind them." The shadow hound padded away into the east as the world celebrated. Its chain no longer dragged on stone. It dragged on memory. In the Second Age, when Sauron rose again and clothed himself in fair forms, he spoke often of gifts and order. Cities rose. Towers gleamed. Men felt proud of their own hands. Yet in the margins, in the places where the world was still wild, wolves grew bolder. In Numenor, a young sailor stood on a white quay at dusk, listening to gulls cry. He smelled tar and salt and fresh-cut wood. He had heard rumors that Sauron, captured, had been brought to the island in chains. He wondered what kind of creature could be both prisoner and threat. That night, in the city's outer streets, dogs began to howl and would not be quieted. The sailor stepped outside and saw at the end of the alley a silhouette darker than the shadows around it. It did not enter the lamplight. It did not need to. It simply watched, and the sailor felt his courage trickle away for no reason he could name. The next day, he signed on to a ship and begged to sail anywhere, even into storms, and as long as it was not near whatever had watched him. When Numenor fell, swallowed by the sea, Many said it was the greatest catastrophe since the breaking of the world. Yet in the roaring flood, amid the screams and the cracking of marble, something else moved through the water like ink. The shadow hound did not drown. It did not breathe. It slipped between waves, as if waves were only curtains. It followed the faithful who escaped, not because it could stop them, but because it could count them. On the shores where Gondor would rise, Isildur planted a sapling of the white tree, and hope took root. But the nights were uneasy. Wolves howled from the mountains, and sometimes the howls sounded like laughter. In the last alliance, when Elendil and Gil-galad marched against Sauron, the air around Mordor stank of sulphur and old death. The plain before Barad-dûr was a churned wasteland of mud and bodies. Soldiers slept in armor, waking at every sound. Fires burned low and smoked, and the smoke tasted bitter. A young archer from the north, an ancestor of those who would later guard the Shire's forgotten borders, stood watch and saw something moving between the tents. He thought it was a dog. Then he saw the size. He raised his bow, hands shaking, and whispered, "Who goes there?" The shape paused. 2 ember eyes lifted. The archer's mouth went dry. The creature did not rush him. It simply stared. And into that stare poured every fear the archer had never admitted. Fear of dying unknown, fear of darkness after death, fear that victory meant nothing. A voice sounded behind him, sharp. "Loose if you must. It is not for you." He turned and saw Elrond, young then in immortal terms, but already ancient in sorrow, his face pale in the firelight. Elrond's gaze was fixed on the creature with a knowing that made the archer's skin prickle. "Lord," the archer whispered. "What is it?" Elrond's voice was quiet, a memory that refuses to die. When the creature moved again, it flowed away, not like a beast fleeing, but like smoke when a door opens. The war ended as the true history held, with Sauron's hand cut and the ring taken. There was relief again, the kind that makes men laugh too loudly and embrace strangers. Yet in the reeds of the gladdened fields, when Isildur fled with the ring's weight around his neck, he heard something behind him besides the splash of orc feet. A chain dragged softly through wet grass. He did not see the eyes until he turned his head, and when he did, he stumbled. The ring slipped from his finger, as if eager to be rid of him, and he plunged into water cold enough to steal breath. The shadow hound did not leap in. It stood on the bank and watched Isildur flail. It watched his fingers claw at the reeds. It watched his mouth open in a silent plea. Isildur sank. The creature's head tilted, as if listening to something far away, something older than the world. Then it turned and vanished into the fog. Centuries rolled like stones down a mountainside. Kingdoms rose and thinned. Plagues came. Winter gnawed at walls. The shadow hound appeared sometimes as an omen, a black shape on a ridge before a battle, a chain sound in a quiet street before a betrayal, ember eyes reflected in a puddle after a murder. In the north, when Angmar rose and the Witch King sent terror through Arnor, a ranger named Araval heard of villages emptied without bloodshed. People had simply fled into the snow and died there, clutching their own arms as if trying to hold themselves together. He rode with a small band through pine forests where the wind moaned like a living thing. The cold bit through wool and leather. At night, they huddled around fire and listened to wolves. On the third night, one of the rangers whispered, "There is a dog outside the light." Araval stared into darkness. The fire popped, sending sparks up. The smell of smoke mixed with the sharp scent of frost. "Show yourself," Araval called, forcing steadiness into his voice. A shape stepped forward just enough for the firelight to catch on nothing. It should have illuminated fur. It did not. Only the eyes appeared, like coals behind a veil. One of the rangers made the sign against evil. Another reached for his sword with a trembling hand. Araval did not move. He remembered old songs his mother had sung, fragments of first-age grief passed down like heirlooms. He had never believed them fully. Now belief came like ice water poured down the spine. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice broke slightly on the last word. The creature opened its mouth. For a heartbeat, Araval thought it might speak. Instead, a faint sound emerged, like chain links shifting. Then it turned away and disappeared. In the years that followed, tales spread among common folk as much as among the wise. In taverns on the edges of Gondor, fishermen spoke of seeing a hound on the beach at dawn, staring out to sea, as if waiting for something to return from the west. In Rohan, shepherds found flocks mauled not as wolves mauled, but as if something had enjoyed the fear first. In the Shire, and long before hobbits thought themselves part of great wars, a bounder named Hob Hayward found strange tracks at the edge of the North Moors. Too large for any dog, too neat for any wolf, and beside them, a thin line in the frost, as if something had dragged a piece of metal. He stared at the tracks and felt ridiculous for being afraid. The Shire was quiet. The biggest trouble was usually a spoiled crop or a drunken brawl. Yet his breath clouded, and he tasted iron in the air. "Must be a big stray," he muttered. Behind him, a dog he had brought along began to whine and pull back, ears flattened, eyes wide. Hob swallowed. He backed away from the tracks, and he did not return to that place for years. When the ring awoke again and the world's old gears began turning, the shadow hound stirred like a sleeper hearing its name. Gandalf felt it first, not as a sight, but as pressure, as a weight in the air that did not match the weather. He stood one evening on the road near Bree, rain soaking his hat brim, and he watched puddles ripple though no wind touched them. Aragorn stood beside him, cloak pulled tight, eyes scanning the hedgerows. "There are many hunters," Aragorn said. "Nazgûl, orcs, spies." Gandalf's gaze remained fixed on the dark beyond the lantern light. "And one older," he murmured. Aragorn glanced at him sharply. "Older than Sauron?" Gandalf did not answer at once. His beard dripped rain. "Older than Sauron's current shape," he said at last. "A wound from the first age that never closed." "What wound walks on 4 feet?" Aragorn asked, and the question sounded almost like a challenge to the world. Gandalf's eyes were sad, one that once guarded what was beautiful. In the wild lands, as the Fellowship moved under branches and over mountains, the shadow hound followed at a distance. It did not rush. It did not need to. The ring drew all things to itself, and the creature had learned patience from Morgoth. Near Hollin, after the snow on Caradhras forced them down, Boromir woke in the night, heart pounding. He had dreamed of a great hound standing over him, chain wrapped around its neck like a garland. In the dream, the hound's eyes were not cruel, only empty. and its mouth opened to speak with a voice like grinding stone. "Serve." Boromir sat up, breath steaming. He looked around. The camp was still. The only sound was the soft snore of a hobbit and the distant creak of trees. He did not tell the others, but he told himself it was only the mountain's malice clinging to his sleep. At the doors of Moria, when the Watcher in the water attacked, Frodo slipped and felt cold tentacles brush him. In that wet chaos, as the others fought and shouted, he heard, through the splashing and the hiss of water, a different sound from the shore behind. A chain clinked on stone. Frodo turned his head and saw, for the briefest moment, ember eyes in the darkness beyond the gate. Not the Watchers, not a goblin's. Something watching the struggle with a stillness that felt intelligent. Then the stone doors shut, and the eyes were gone. Inside Moria, the air was stale and tasted of dust. The Fellowship's footsteps echoed in endless halls. Somewhere far below, drums began to beat. When the Balrog revealed itself, flame and shadow in one terrible form, even the shadow hound paused in its pursuit. Some ancient instinct recoiled. Morgoth's servant recognized Morgoth's old fire. On the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf fell, and grief struck like a hammer. The Fellowship fled into sunlight, weeping, gasping, stumbling on roots and stones. For a moment, it felt again like an ending. The wise guide lost, the road broken, the world tilting toward despair. In Lórien, under golden leaves, Galadriel stood before the mirror and saw many possible futures. In this altered thread, one image returned again and again. A great hound with chains of shadow, running across a field of dead grass under a starless sky. "What is it?" Sam asked, his voice small in the vastness of elven beauty. He did not know the weight of First Age names, but he knew fear. Galadriel's eyes rested on him, and for an instant, he saw sorrow older than any hill in the Shire. "A faithful heart that was taken," she said. "It hunts still." "Can it be turned back?" Frodo asked, and the question came out before he could stop it. Galadriel looked toward the east, where darkness gathered. "Some things can be healed," she said. "Some can only be ended." The road split. The Fellowship broke. In the chaos at Amon Hen, when Aragorn ran through trees and heard the clash of steel and the cries of orcs, he sensed the Shadowhound close at last. The air grew cold even in summer. The birds fell silent. Aragorn found Boromir dying, arrows like black thorns in his chest. Boromir's breath rattled. His eyes were wet. "They took the little ones," Boromir whispered. "I tried." Aragorn gripped his hand. "You did better than you know." Boromir's gaze flicked past Aragorn's shoulder. Fear widened his eyes. "Behind you," he rasped. Aragorn turned, sword raised. At the edge of the clearing stood the Shadowhound. It was larger than any wolf, its form half smoke, half scarred flesh, and around its neck was the suggestion of a collar that glowed faintly like iron heated in a forge. The chain trailing from it did not touch the ground, yet the sound of it was there, a constant whisper. Aragorn held his sword steady. "In the name of the West," he said, voice low, "what are you?" The creature's eyes fixed on him. In those eyes, Aragorn saw something that made his heart clench. A flicker of recognition, as if part of the creature remembered a different life, a different loyalty. Then the flicker died, smothered by shadow. The creature stepped forward. Legolas' arrow flew from the trees and passed through its shoulder, as if through fog. Gimli's axe swung with a roar, and met resistance for a heartbeat, and then slid through smoky flesh, leaving no wound that mattered. Aragorn felt, in that moment, the truth that Melian had known. This was not a beast that could be fought only with steel. It was a command given shape, a leash pulled from beyond the world. "What does it serve?" Aragorn demanded, and his voice rang with anger that tried to cover dread. The creature opened its mouth. For the first time since Huan's death, a voice emerged, broken, layered, as if two throats tried to speak at once. "Not Sauron," it said, and the words were heavy, dragged up from deep water. Older. Aragorn's breath hitched. "Morgoth," he whispered, and it was not a question. The Shadowhound's eyes flared. It lunged. Aragorn met it head-on, and the impact jolted his arm to the shoulder. Cold flooded into him where the creature touched, a chill that felt like despair made physical. He staggered, teeth clenched, and forced himself to hold ground. Then, from the dying man at his feet, a weak voice rose. "Go," Boromir whispered, not to Aragorn, but to the creature, as if pleading with a nightmare. "We have suffered enough." For a heartbeat, the Shadowhound paused. Its head turned slightly toward Boromir. Its eyes dimmed, and for an instant, something almost like grief moved through its posture. Was there still a heart somewhere inside the shadow? Could loyalty be resurrected, or only exploited? How many ages could a command endure before it wore away what it controlled? The pause ended. The creature shook itself like a dog shaking off water, and the ember brightness returned. Aragorn understood then that mercy would not stop it. Only an ending would. He stepped back, drawing the creature toward him, away from Boromir's body. Legolas and Gimli closed in, weapons ready, and though their faces showed the dawning realization that they were facing something not meant for their hands. Then the creature did something unexpected. It turned its head sharply, as if hearing a call none of them could hear, and it bolted into the trees, vanishing as suddenly as it had come. Aragorn stood trembling, not from exertion, but from the cold left behind. He stared into the forest's shadow, and he felt the world widen. This war was not only against Sauron, not only against the Ring, but against remnants that had never been fully swept away. He went back to Boromir. The man was dead. Later, when Rohan's plains thundered under hooves and Theoden rode to war, wolves ran alongside orc companies more often than they should have, and the wolves did not always fight like animals. They fought like soldiers. At night, in camps outside Helm's Deep, men woke to the sound of chain links faintly tapping armor, though no chains were there. Some whispered prayers, which some drank until they could not hear. In Minas Tirith, before the siege, a baker's wife stood on a high street and watched the sky bruise with smoke from the east. She smelled burning even before the first fires came, as if the wind carried tomorrow's ash. Her child clung to her skirt and asked, "Will the king come?" She swallowed and lied gently. "He will," she said, "because hope is sometimes only a story told with conviction." On the Pelennor fields, when the battle roared and the Nazgul screamed overhead, the Shadowhound ran through the chaos unseen by most, leaving fear in its wake like a scent. Horses shied and screamed, eyes rolling. Men stumbled without knowing why. An orc captain fell to his knees, clutching his head, as if a voice inside him had suddenly demanded obedience he could not give. The shadow hound did not care who lived or died there. It cared about one thing: the ring, moving nearer to the place where endings happened. At last, when the Black Gate opened and Aragorn marched on Mordor with a small host to draw Sauron's eye, the air outside the Morannon was dry and tasted of dust. The ground was cracked like old skin. Mountains loomed like broken teeth. The host stood in a thin line, dwarfed by the gate and the towers. Men of Gondor tightened grips on spears. Riders of Rohan shifted in saddles, horses blowing hot breath into cold air. The sun was a pale coin behind smoke. Aragorn rode forward. His voice carried, clear and steady. "Let the Lord of the Black Land come forth," he called. "Let justice be done." From the shadow between the teeth of the gate, something moved low to the ground. The shadow hound emerged. It walked, not ran, and each step seemed to press cold into the air. Its chain was visible now, not as metal, but as darkness made solid, trailing behind and fading into nothing. Its eyes were bright enough to make men flinch away. A murmur ran through the host. Some men crossed themselves in old gestures. Others simply stared, unable to name what they saw. Eomer, king of Rohan, leaned toward Aragorn, voice tight. "That is no warg." Aragorn's jaw was set. "No," he said. "It is an old betrayal." The creature stopped within bowshot. It lifted its head and sniffed the air, as if tasting fear and courage like spices. Then it spoke, its voice a grinding of two worlds together. "Where is the halfling?" it asked. The question hit like a blow, because it meant the creature knew, truly knew, what mattered. Aragorn raised his sword, and Duril's blade catching what little light remained. "You will not touch him," he said. The shadow hound's eyes narrowed. "You cannot stop." "What was commanded," it said, and there was strain in the words, as if part of it resisted speaking at all. Aragorn's voice dropped, meant for those near him more than for the enemy. "It is bound," he said, "like a slave." "Can a slave choose?" Eomer asked, and the question carried a bitter edge. Aragorn did not answer, because the creature moved again, and the moment for philosophy vanished into the need to survive. The shadow hound charged, arrows flew, spears lowered. The creature hit the line like a wave of winter, and men cried out as cold seeped into their limbs, slowing them. The swords that struck it passed through smoke and met sudden resistance where ancient flesh remained, scarred and half real. The creature tore through shields with jaws that were not merely teeth, but command made weapon. Aragorn met it, blade flashing. He struck where the collar glowed faintest, and the blade rang as if it had hit iron. The creature recoiled, not from pain, but from recognition. And in that recoil, Aragorn saw it. Beneath the shadow, beneath the ember eyes, there was a shape that had once been noble. "Huan," Aragorn said, and he spoke the name like a prayer and a blade both. "If any of you remains, hear me." The creature froze. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to fall away. The sounds of men shouting and orcs screaming dimmed. Even the wind paused. The creature's eyes flickered, and something else looked out. A voice emerged, faint, layered beneath the grinding. "Do not follow," it whispered. Aragorn's breath caught. He heard in those words an echo of Lúthien's grief, of Melion's warning, of the First Age's long shadow. Then the ember brightness surged again, trying to drown the flicker. The collar flared. chain trembled. The creature lunged at Aragorn's throat. Aragorn raised his sword to block, and in that instant, something shifted far away, beyond sight, beyond sound. At Orodruin, the ring was destroyed. The world did not explode. It exhaled. A tremor ran through the earth like a sigh of relief. The air changed, as if a pressure that had been constant all life had suddenly lifted. In Mordor, towers cracked. Baradur's foundations groaned. Sauron's power unspooled like smoke in wind. On the battlefield before the Black Gate, the Shadow Hound slammed into Aragorn and then halted mid-motion, as if struck by an invisible blow. Its eyes widened. The ember light faltered. The collar around its neck, that hidden iron of Morgoth's command, glowed bright for one terrible moment, then began to fracture. Hairline cracks of pale light ran through it. Not the Silmarils' light, not elven light, but something like the first dawn after a long night. The creature staggered back, shaking. A sound emerged from it that was not a growl, not a howl, but a cry of pain and release. Men around it paused, weapons raised, unsure. Orcs screamed and fled as the world around them began to collapse. Aragorn stepped forward slowly, sword lowered. His voice was hoarse. "It is ending," he said, though he did not know if he spoke to the creature or to himself. The Shadow Hound's form began to unravel. Smoke peeled away in tatters. Beneath, for a moment, a great hound stood as it had once been. Massive, scarred, noble, eyes no longer ember bright, but dark and deep. Huan looked at Aragorn, and through Aragorn, as if seeing beyond time. His mouth opened. Words came, clear now without grinding shadow. "Forgive," Huan said, and the single word carried the weight of ages. Then the collar shattered. The chain that had trailed behind him snapped like a whip and vanished into nothing. A gust of wind rushed through the field, warm for the first time, carrying the smell of crushed grass and distant rain. Huan's body dissolved, not into smoke, but into a scatter of pale motes that rose like fireflies and were gone. For a breath, relief swept the host, raw and trembling. Men laughed and cried without knowing why. Neoma wiped his face with the back of his hand and stared at the empty space where the creature had stood. "He was freed," Eoma said, voice rough. Aragorn did not answer at once. His eyes were fixed on the ground. In the dust at his feet, there were no tracks. Nothing remained. And yet, as the Black Gate's towers began to crumble and the earth shook with Mordor's ruin, Aragorn felt disquiet creep in under the relief, like a cold draught under a door. If the ring's end could shatter Morgoth's last leash, what else had been held in place by that old architecture of domination? What other remnants would now drift loose, unanchored, seeking new shapes? In the days after, when the eagles bore news and the west sang again, ordinary lives resumed in small ways. In Minas Tirith, the baker's wife lit her oven and smelled flour warming, and she wept because the smell meant tomorrow existed. In Rohan, a shepherd walked out at dawn and found his flock intact, and the silence of the hills sounded like mercy. In the Shire, Samwise Gamgee returned and put his hands into soil, and the earth felt real beneath his nails. Yet there were changes that did not announce themselves in banners or songs. Elrond, preparing to leave Middle-earth at last, stood on the deck of a grey ship and watched the shoreline recede. The air smelled of salt and longing. He closed his eyes and remembered a great hound bounding through grass under a younger sky. He remembered, too, ember eyes in darkness and the clink of an unseen chain. "It is ended," someone said softly behind him. Elrond opened his eyes. "One thread is ended," he replied. "But the wound remains in the world, even when the knife is gone." In Gondor, Aragorn sat alone one night in the quiet of his chambers, listening to the city breathe. The white tree's scent drifted in through an open window. He rested his hand on the hilt of his sword and stared into the darkness beyond the glass. He thought of Huan's last word, "Forgive." He wondered who it had been meant for. Lúthien, long beyond the circles of the world. Melian, vanished. The Valar, who had sent a noble creature into a land where even nobility could be used. Or for Middle-earth itself, which had always been a battlefield for powers it did not choose. In Rohan, Éowyn rode out on a spring morning and heard wolves in the far hills. The sound made her shoulders tense. Then she listened again and realized it was only wolves, only animals calling to each other. The realization did not bring full peace. It brought the strange knowledge that peace is not the absence of fear, but the presence of choices. In the Shire, years later, a bounder walked the North Moors again, older now, slower. Frost lay on the grass, and the air smelled of clean cold. He stopped where he had once found the tracks. He expected nothing. He told himself he had been foolish long ago. Then he saw it. A single line in the frost, thin and straight, as if something had been dragged there. No paw prints beside it, no sign of any creature, just the mark, leading out into the white and vanishing where the ground dipped. He stared until his eyes watered from the cold. Somewhere far off, a dog barked in a farmyard, ordinary and alive. The bounder swallowed and turned back toward home. Behind him, in the empty moor, the line in the frost seemed to deepen for a moment, as if an unseen chain had tugged once, attesting whether the world still remembered how to fear.